1155. Okay.
All right. Do we know if there's a way to check if we have the right link in places? Because I'm not seeing anyone in the waiting room.
Yeah, I don't see anybody either. Here we see some.
Oh,
I see a couple
okay.
of my friends.
Oh, I think, yeah. Hello, everyone. All right, I think we're good to just get going, start right on time. So just want to say hello to everyone and thank you for joining us today for our virtual talk. We ask that you keep yourselves muted through this presentation. If you do have any questions or comments, please type your questions right into the chat at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker will be happy to address any questions or comments at the end of the program. If you're joining us over Facebook Live, we welcome you as well. Our Facebook audience can ask questions using the comment section on Facebook. We will be monitoring those comments and answering those questions at the end of the program as well. Please note that this talk is being recorded and live streamed. We will post, and this talk will be posted to our social media channels once the talk is over. If you'd like to rewatch this talk or any previous virtual tours and talks, please check out our YouTube or our Facebook pages. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker, Karen, to you. Her talk today is on Flemish art in the 15th and 16th century, and as always, it's promising to be a very interesting and engaging talk. So I'll let you take it away, Karen.
Kyla, thank you so much. Yes, I have to agree that, and I'm going to show you an image actually from our very own Timken collection. This is a work by Petrus Christus. I usually just introduce the topic and I'll have an image for you to look at. And then I will proceed to go through this particular work of art a little bit later. But suffice to say, the Flemish Renaissance is exquisite. And let's talk a little about the geography of this region and time and what is happening. Now, when you think about the word Flemish Renaissance, or some people say Netherlandish, now, is there a distinction? Somewhat, there is a slight distinction. And when I say Netherlandish, I'm including the region that would be today Holland and Belgium. And the Flemish region would be primarily the Flanders, or today Belgium. It would be parts of France, parts of Luxembourg. So Belgium, France, and Luxembourg. And then if we say Netherlandish, we're kind of including more of the Dutch region. Now, just quickly, in 1517, we have the beginning of the Protestant Reformation with Martin Luther. So this era, most of what we're going to be talking about is pre-Reformation, and it was controlled in this period of time, the 15th and 16th centuries, by the Burgundian court. the court of the Burgundian counts. So for example, we would have a lot of, the people who would be collecting and sponsoring a lot of this art were coming from the Burgundian court, which was a very successful one under the Valois counts. Now, later, we have in the 16th century, the Habsburgs take over. And so, but the time that most of what we're talking about today would be under the French court, the Valois court. And who were the counts? It would be Philip the Good, for example, and his offspring, who sponsored many of these wonderful Flemish artists. Now, Flanders, we're going to sponsor, most of the art that's sponsored here was in Bruges and Ghent, two magnificent cities. And Bruges is really the center. If you think about Jan van Eyck, for example, he was centered in the city of Bruges. Bruges was considered the Venice of the North. Why? Because with a series of canals and rivers, it actually had access toward the North Sea. So it made it a very good trading center. The one set of goods that was so important to the region was cloth trade. So cloth, and you'll see this in many of the paintings, magnificent clothing and cloth. So cloth was really important. And many of the people living in Bruges were becoming wealthy with this cloth trade and the fact that there was so much imports and exports leaving Bruges. And so they had a desire to show off their wealth with great works of art. We also have the important manuscript illuminations. And even here in this painting, we see a book. So before 1440, books are all made by hand. And many of these artists, like Jan van Eyck, who we'll be looking at, was actually a manuscript illuminator. So many of the artists located in Bruges and Ghent were not only manuscript illuminators, some of them were sculptors at the higher end. They were making panels. And what kind of art were they creating? They were creating mostly religious art with complex iconography. And they also did beautiful portraits. Historical paintings, mythological paintings, not common at this time. So we'll begin with this absolutely beautiful altarpiece, the Marode altarpiece. Now this artist, Robert Campen, sometimes called the Master of Flamand, and I see that there is a little bit of a misspelling, I apologize, not female, but Flamand, was probably the segue from the medieval to the Renaissance. So at this time, 1427, we are entering the Northern Renaissance. Robert Campen, along with Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden, were probably the three trio of great artists. There were many more we're going to look at, but these three really were the genesis of Flemish painting in the 15th and 16th century. What are some of the aspects of Flemish painting? There is a jewel-like quality to the paint. There is a huge attention to detail, beautifully detailed. And some of these artists were really great at capturing emotion. You begin to see perspective. You begin to see realism and nature. So they really are developing some important concepts in art. One of them being the use of oil painting. Now, what was happening before was the use of egg tempera. But artists like Robert Campen and Jan van Eyck saw the beauty and the importance of using oil painting. The colors could be richer, it dried slower, but the depth of color was much more profound. Also, they are beginning to experiment with single point perspective. Now, you don't see that in this Campen altarpiece, but you will begin to see it with the work of Petrus Christus. This is a triptych. The Flemish painters were very great at doing panel painting. That was kind of their focus. You would have everything from a diptych, 2-panel, triptych, 3-panel, and polyptych, which would be multi-panel. Some of the central panels on these works of art were lost, but fortunately, the Merode altarpiece actually has 3 panels intact. Perhaps, however, this donor panel on the left was added. How do we know that, or why do we surmise that? If you look at the donor here, she is crowded into the space. So it is thought that perhaps the central panel was done and these were added later. These, of course, these works are all on wood. It really wasn't until the 16th century in Italy that we begin to see the use of canvas. It was called the Merode altarpiece because a family Merode owned it later, but it was originally commissioned by another family, and you see Isenbrat, and you can see their coat of arms here. So what is in this central panel? We have by Robert Campen. And I just wanted to mention that Campen was, he was really involved with the use of realism. He was a pupil of, his pupil was Rogier van der Weyden, another great artist, and he was active in a city called Tournai. So he begins his really great career with this altarpiece, and the central panel is the Annunciation. So the angel Gabriel is announcing to Mary that she will bear the Christ child. You have a beautiful illuminated manuscript. Remember, at this time, 1427, when this painting was begun, books were not, the printing press had not been invented. So all these books were beautifully illustrated and handmade, and it was for the wealthy class. So the angel crowds, I apologize, the angel crowds the space, and it's a lot of action in the front of the altarpiece. And then we have Mary beautifully depicted looking at a book, and we have lots of iconography. Iconography, of course, means images that have a meaning, and particularly in this case, a religious meaning. So we have this beautiful vase with white lilies. And of course, that represents the purity of Mary. We have a little bit of water fountain, quasi water fountain, and again, the purity of Mary. We have a little Holy Ghost streaming through the light that comes from this window. And then we have a fireplace. What makes this a really remarkable altarpiece is that it is not in a religious setting. It is in a contemporary of that time, early 15th century, contemporary of that time, their home. It would be a middle class, slightly upper middle class family's home. And we have a very interesting perspective. The table seems to tilt. The robes of the angel and Mary seem to flow. Now, remember, I told you cloth was an important product at this time. So we see beautiful depictions of cloth with this lovely belt. And then, of course, we have these exquisite wings. Now, let's look at what's happening in some of the other panels. As I mentioned, we have a guard at the gate of the city, probably Tournai, and then we have the donors. Most panels in these Flemish paintings, the donors are on either side of the panel. And what do we have here? Well, we have Joseph, who is much older, and he's betrothed to Mary, and he's in his workshop, and he's busily making mousetraps. And it was said that St. Augustine said that mousetraps were the work of the devil, and we related them to the making of crosses for the crucifixion. So they have a very negative connotation. But Joseph is quietly working. You see mousetraps here, here, and here. And I hope that my cursor is able to capture this. So the Merode altarpiece, considered one of the most beautiful early Flemish paintings. It's really the genesis of Flemish painting, and it becomes the segue from medieval to Renaissance. I do want to make a comparison just before I move on to say what is happening in Italy stylistically is a little bit different than what is happening in the North. Why? Because humanism is really big in the Italian Renaissance. Also, what is very significant is the influence of Greco-Roman heritage, sculpture, architecture. So that is prominent in a lot of Italian works of art, but of course that is not true for the North. But there is a cross-pollination. There is a great cross-pollination from what is happening in Flanders and what is happening in Italy. And many of these artists became so famous, particularly Jan van Eyck, who we're going to look at next, that his work was greatly revered in Italy. All right, Jan van Eyck, one of my absolute favorite artists, and this is one of my most beloved paintings. Jan van Eyck was a contemporary of Robert Campin, who we just looked at, and he's considered one of the most significant artists who ever lived. And of course, particularly of the 15th century. He was active in Bruges. He came, I think, originally from Ghent, and he was popular in his own lifetime. His greatest contributions to art really was the evolution of oil painting. It isn't so much apparent in this particular, the Virgin of Chancellor Roland, but when we look at subsequent paintings by him, you'll see this rich, deep color. He used a lot of overlaying. He used a lot of animal products to kind of get that glazing. He painted over and over to really get that saturated color. So what do we have here? We have a crowded loggia, an open courtyard with columns, and we have these beautiful columns and light coming in through next to these Corinthian capitals. They come from either side. And who was Chancellor Roland? Well, he was a very wealthy man in the city of Autun, France, and he commissioned this for his own private chapel. And he is in the presence of the Virgin Mary. He's in the presence of such greatness that he doesn't even look directly at her. He sort of looks to the side because of this profound presence. She is being crowned here as the Queen of Heaven with this lovely angel and this intricate crown. And she holds the baby Jesus on her lap, and he holds an orb with a cross, and that signifies that he's Salvator Mundi, Savior of the world. And Chancellor Roland is kneeling in this sort of little lectern, and he has an open manuscript. Again, an illuminated manuscript. I'm sorry, my cursor keeps kind of going ahead. There's a lot of other things in this painting. As I mentioned earlier, lots of iconography in these religious paintings. What are some of them? Well, we have a peacock, which symbolizes Jesus. And then we have another bird, the magpie. And that symbolizes eternal life, but it also symbolizes too much pride. So it has a negative connotation. So what we have is a juxtaposition of good and evil with the birds. We also have these two men, and it is suggested that the figure on the right could be Jan van Eyck himself. The red chapeau that he wears is seen in his very own portraits. Then we have the city of Autun, and we have vineyards, because Chancellor Roland was, as I said, a very wealthy man, and one of his manners of increasing his wealth was his vineyards. But then on the right, we have these exquisite, massive cathedral, so delicate. So what does Jan van Eyck present? Beautiful figuration, incredible detail and realism, these iconographic representations, and a very deeply religious image. One other thing I wanted to point out here are the beautiful white flowers, and flowers are often used to represent the purity of Mary, her sorrows, her experiences. So you will often see flowers in some of these paintings. So just to recap, her beautiful red cloak, Mary's often shown in red and blue. She sits on this little throne with a pillow. The angel hovers to crown her, and the chancellor looks at her with such deference. The space is really crowded. There's only about 6 feet apart. And you even wonder how the chancellor got into the room with this light pouring in from the window, but it almost looks like he would have had to turn to the side. So those are some aspects of this magnificent painting, which is now in the Louvre. We will go on to one of the most exquisite portraits ever done. The Arnolfini portrait, the marriage portrait of Arnolfini. Who was Arnolfini? Well, he had to be a very wealthy man because he would not be able to have Jan van Eyck paint this exquisite portrait of the Mr. Arnolfini and his bride. But there's a lot of controversy in this painting in that when we look at the date and we start to look at records of the Arnolfini family, we see that the couple was actually married 8 years before this painting was done. And the sad thing is, even though it looks like she is with child, she is not. But she actually died during childbirth. So that's quite sad. So some people say maybe this is actually a painting in memory of her, or maybe not. Who was Arnolfini? He was living in Bruges, where Jan van Eyck was settled. And he was part of the merchants who were attached to the Medici family. Because I said there's a lot of cross-pollination between the Italians and the Flemish. So many of the Medici family and others would come into Bruges and then Ghent and other cities, Brussels, to really increase their wealth. We know that this is an upper bourgeois, some say quite wealthy. It's hard to determine because she does not wear really any over jewelry. She has maybe a gold chain here and maybe something at her wrist, but she is not showing great wealth with her jewelry. But look at the incredible clothing that they wear. His ermine embellished outfit, quite luxurious, and this hat is actually made of straw and it's beautifully tightly woven. So it showed a lot of skill. And then, of course, the woman's dress is absolutely gorgeous. This deep, deep green. And look at how rich the use of oil paintings. As I mentioned, that Jan van Eyck is known for his use of oil painting, but look how rich and deep the colors are. The way that the dress is held up would mean, again, a wealthy woman, because you would almost need a maid to take up the extra fabric. And when you first look at it, it looks like she might be with child, but she isn't. She's just holding up the extra folds. What else is in the picture? Well, the red represents fecundity, or she wants to have a child, as does the oranges. The oranges also represent wealth because this was a trading center, as I mentioned, the Venice of the North, and oranges were coming from exotic places like Spain. So you had to have money to have these oranges. We have a little rose bush out here, and that means passion for marriage. We have a convex mirror with some of the images of the passion in these little vignettes here. And then we have a reflection. Now, if you go to the Baroque and you look at the work of Velázquez in Spain and Las Meninas, you know that Velázquez had looked at this great work of Jan van Eyck, and he uses a mirror in that painting as well. This is the bed chamber of the couple. We know that, of course, because the bed is on the right. And then we also have this beautiful chandelier. And then there's this one candle, and that is probably the presence of God. We have fidelity represented by this little Fido, this dog, and then these shoes, what would show marital happiness, because if you have a clean and happy home, there's a lot of peace, and you would put on different shoes when you came into the interior of the house, and that would be represented here. There is a beautiful signature, and Jan van Eyck was really remarkable in that he would often sign his paintings with an elaborate signature. Most artists did not sign at this time. And he also puts something like Jan van Eyck was here or is present. So he really wanted you to know that he was part of the creation of this work. When I say part of course, he created this, but we had great workshops. And these workshops often had other artists kind of completing some of the works, not necessarily in this case. So we're going to move on. And I believe one of the most beautiful altarpieces ever created was the Adoration of the Mystic Lamb. And this is sometimes called the Ghent altarpiece by Jan and Hubert van Eyck. There are so many stories around this magnificent work of art. And I actually, a couple times in my life, have made pilgrimages to the city of Ghent, Belgium, to see this altarpiece because it's beyond belief. And it's massive, and it is in St. Baubil's Cathedral. It is 12 panels, so it's a polyptych. It's a multi-panel work of art. And of course, it would be very difficult. It would take an hour or more to talk about it. So I'm going to talk about one of my favorite panels, and this is at the lower register of the multi-panel work of art. It's at the bottom, but it is the largest. There is a lot of mystery around this particular entire altarpiece, in that it says Hubert and Jan van Eyck. Hubert was the brother of Jan van Eyck. Some people would say that he started this amazing, great artwork. Others think he did very little, maybe just created the frame, and then Jan took over. We really don't know. There were several siblings in the family, but Hubert, of course, was the best known aside from his brilliant brother. So we will say that Hubert van Eyck had his hand in the creation of this magnificent polyptych, but we're going to focus on Jan van Eyck here. So as I mentioned, there's 12 panels. This is the lower one, and we have Christ as a lamb, and the blood flows from his body. If you are to visit the San Diego Museum of Art, you will see a beautiful painting called Agnus Dei, and that represents, by Zurbaran, and that represents the same Christ as the lamb, the sacrificial lamb. It also represents a lot of other things. It represents the Eucharist. It represents the purity of Jesus here with the fountain. We have the Holy Ghost and light as it spills across the lamb's body. And then we see water flowing, and we see all manner of musicians and angels and judges and priests. All these people come to witness the sacrifice of Jesus. And it is, as I said, considered probably the most important early Flemish altarpiece. We will be looking at some others. And it was commissioned by what's called the Weyden family, VIJD family that commissioned it. And we see this crystalline water. So we know that Jan van Eyck was very interested in realism. And we also, if you recall me saying, he was a manuscript illuminator. So detail is profound. We see little still lifes in the landscapes, in the field. We see the purity of Mary here with the lily. We have this beautiful city of Ghent. Now, Jan van Eyck lived in Ghent and then eventually relocated to Bruges. But look at the palm tree, this exquisite composite cathedral, and this amazing depth of field. So we also see the sacrifice of Christ, and it symbolizes the Eucharist. We see the total picture is the redemption of humankind. So if you ever get to the city of Ghent, please take time. Before I close and move on, because of course I take too much time and then I run out and I have to race through, but this particular work of art, this great work of art, had 4 really scary episodes. In the 17th century, during the Protestant Reformation, some of these panels were nearly destroyed. Now we have so many aspects to this panel, and it was painted inside and out, outer panels, inside. And then in the First World War, parts of the panel were stolen. And then in the Second World War, Goebbels, I believe, the horrific Nazi, tried to steal it, and they took it away and they put it in salt mines and hid it. And it was documented in a movie called The Monument Man, I believe. That was the rescue of this great work of art. So we're going to go on just for time. And we're going to look at the work of Rogier van der Weyden. Rogier van der Weyden was a student of Robert Campen, and I put him in the trio of absolute great artists. I can't cover all the brilliant artists that lived at this time. And so I will concentrate, of course, on the ones I think made such stellar contributions. What did Rogier van der Weyden do? He continued the use of oil painting and developed its beauty. He shows such great emotion in his works of art. Look at the faces on this deposition. And we can see his use of emotion. Look at the faces on these 9 figures, and I'll talk about some of them in more detail. But I wanted to point out color. Look at this magnificent ultramarine blue. And this blue came from lapis. And many of these artists were able to get lapis as it traded through what would be today Afghanistan, and came into not only Italy, but also to the north. So obviously all the pigments were natural pigments. Mary is shown in abject emotional sadness. Her body is slumped and it's in an S curve. And then we have the body of Jesus as it is brought down from the cross. And you see their hands almost touch. And you see the blood here, the stigmata here, and the crown of thorns. In the corner of this painting would be the crossbows. Why crossbows? Because the crossbow, the group of people who manufactured crossbows at that time commissioned this. Remember, there were lots of artists working in workshops, and they would commission great artists to make works of art that would decorate their churches, their homes, and also where they would gather. So we'll continue. We have someone holding some nails. He's a worker and he's gently help Jesus as he goes down. And then we have one of the Pharisees here, Nicodemus, and then Joseph of Arimathea here. We have Mary Magdalene, and she brackets with St. John the body, the lowering of the body. I apologize. And then we have Mary Claeissens here, and she is Mary Salome here, and she is crying. And you can see the deep emotion on the faces. I apologize again. I'm having a little problem with my computer. But you see the deep emotion. They're trying to be gentle. They're trying to be caring. And we also have the crowding of the figures in these 9 figures in this very tight space. We have here 2 iconographic representations. This is Golgotha, and that is the skull of Adam. And then, of course, the leg bone. These paintings are filled with iconography. We also have some beautiful flowers here, the great detail. And then let's relate again to the cloth, this really different colors and patterns of cloth. And the Burgundian court loved to show off their wealth, and as did the upper bourgeois who would be commissioning these paintings, whether it was a guild, or whether it was individuals, or whether it was the court. We're going to look at another work by Rogier van der Weyden. And he was known for, again, portraiture and multi-panel pieces. And probably one of his most famous is St. Luke drawing the Virgin. This is actually in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. I've been privileged to be able to see it. But there's also a couple other renditions. I believe there's one in Russia and then one other place. And there was some damage to this particular work. Actually, the top part of the panel was had to be reattached. And we're not quite sure if this was a triptych, but we only have the central panel here. It has been said since the 8th century that St. Luke tried to paint the Virgin, and they wanted a representation of her. Who was St. Luke? Well, St. Luke was the patron saint of artists, and he was also considered the patron saint of doctors. Some people would say that the robes that St. Luke is wearing mirrors what doctors would wear at that time. Others say clergy. That's not 100% established. It's also true that a lot is not known about these early Flemish paintings. I mean, there's a lot of research being done. There's not a lot of documentation. So sometimes some of these issues have not been completely resolved. If you look at this beautiful face, it is perhaps a self-portrait of Rogier van der Weyden. And then we have this very natural portrait of Mary. And we can actually see her nursing the baby Jesus. And if you look very closely, there's literally a little drop of milk to suggest she's feeding him. And she sits on, looks like kind of a narrow bench, and he is kneeling on a pillow. And he's using a silver stylus. A stylus helps to, like a pencil, and he holds the paper at right angle. Why? Because he's really showing how Rogier van der Weyden would actually paint. We also have perspective. We have Corinthian capitals here with these columns and an exterior space. Again, this is like a loggia or portico. And we have two figures. It is said that these are Joachim and Margaret, the parents of Mary, and they're looking out into this beautiful landscape of a Flemish city. And you can see the walled city, and you can see trees and the sky and the detail. Everything is so highly detailed. Now, if you glance over to the right here, you see a bull. And the bull was actually the representation of St. Luke. So we have a canopy here, a beautiful canopy. Now, there is supposed to be a snake that is somewhere here. And I have been looking, and in this particular image, I really can't see it, the temptation in the garden, but we have her flowing robes, her blue, and her look of maternal love. Again, this manuscript, pre-printed books with the Gutenberg Bible, and then that light as it comes through the room. And we have, now we're going to move on to the work of Petrus Christus. Petrus Christus, fortunately, is represented in the Timken collection, and we will look at that momentarily. But Petrus Christus took over from Jan van Eyck in Bruges. Some people say he completely took over. He wasn't born in Bruges. He was active in Bruges along with Hans Memling, who I'm not going to talk about. I'm sorry. Because of time constraints, Hans Memling was actually German, although he did work in Bruges, and some of his most important artworks are actually in the city of Bruges at the hospital there, which is now a museum. So he was influenced by Rogier van der Weyden and Jan van Eyck, and he kind of took over. This is one of my favorite paintings, a goldsmith in his shop. So highly detailed, so meticulous. What does it capture? There's so much iconography. There's so many interesting objects in this painting that we're going to talk about. But what do we have here? We have a goldsmith. Now, some people say that this was actually a saint and he was a patron saint of goldsmiths, but others believe that probably not, that this is actually a goldsmith who was working at the time in the city of Bruges. Remember, again, these Burgundian counts and royal families were trying to show their wealth. They had money to spend. They could have jewelry and paintings and sculpture, all manner of interesting artifact and artwork. So you see a lot of the wealth of this community mirrored here. So the goldsmith is weighing the gold ring, and you see a host of gold rings here. That's pretty straightforward. We have a beautiful belt, and it's S-curved along the tabletop here, and it represents a matrimonial belt. Her gown is exquisite, beautifully detailed, and you see that her betrothed kind of has a proprietal arm around her, kind of bringing her close, and they're looking together at what the jeweler has to offer. He's kind of weighing the gold. If you look directly at the goldsmith, he's very detailed. His portrait is very detailed, and they've kind of looked at the underpainting. These two, not as evolved, still interesting, but not quite as evolved. Petrus Christus was a brilliant portrait painter. So we know this is a wealthy family because of all this embellishment in her headdress, exquisite costume, and the fact that they could commission a goldsmith. We have some other things here. We have coral from the sea, and we have shark's teeth. Well, shark's teeth, what were they used for? Some people say that they would be used to detect poison. Interesting. We have a coconut goblet, that's actually a coconut shell. And then we have these things that look like reliquaries, but they were actually used to collect money to give to different philanthropies in the city of Bruges, as this goldsmith was wont to do. A couple more things I wanted to point out. We have these beautiful beads and we have all these gemstones. Now, the gemstones represent different medical aspects of stones. For example, rubies might cure throat ailments. Maybe sapphires would cure ailments of the eye. So this is the early days before it evolved medicine. So of course, there's a lot of, let's say, unrealistic medical ideas, but of course, we're in the 15th century. One other thing I want to point out is this exquisite, again, convex mirror. You see this a lot in the Northern Renaissance. And they show a man, the city of Bruges in the background, and we see a man holding a falcon. And that kind of represents probably pride and the fact that the hawk was often used as entertainment for the highborn. So we're going to move on because of time. And we're going to go to our very own Petrus Christus in the Timken Museum. This painting was the central panel, a triptych with two accompanying panels, but those were lost during World War II. But we're very fortunate to have this magnificent work of art. It's remarkable to have a Petrus Christus, not only on the West Coast, but in San Diego. No, there's one other Petrus Christus at the Los Angeles County Museum, a portrait of a man. And I'm not sure if the Getty has one, but suffice to say, there are very, very few of these. I think there's only 20 to 30 works by Petrus Christus. I know for Jan van Eyck, there's only about 20 extant works, and I believe with Petrus Christus, it's between 20 and 30. But let's look at this work of art. One of the things it points out to us is that Petrus Christus is known for developing single point perspective, and we actually have this here. We also have a story from apocryphal literature. This is not from the Bible. It comes from stories that were handed down. The death of the Virgin. Excuse me. And what makes us very remarkable too is we actually look at 3 vignettes as our eyes circle through the painting. So we'll look at the first vignette. This is the bedchamber of Mary. She's on her deathbed. And as she dies, the candle represents her spirit ascending to heaven, her purity and her spirit. And you see her moving upward. She's carried by angels. And she ascends to heaven, represented by God, who is waiting at the top of the painting to welcome her. So first vignette, second vignette, and let's go diagonally to what is happening outside in the landscape. We have doubting Thomas looking up to the heavens, and he looks to the angel who says to him, I know you're mourning. I know you don't want to believe Mary has passed, but she has. And this is her girdle or her belt. And I want to show you that she has passed. So it's a very tragic scene. And we have these disciples who surround her. And their eyes are red rimmed and they're in mourning. And they look and they can't believe. And then we have one who is resting here, probably asleep. And it probably symbolizes someone who has waited and begun the mourning process. And he symbolizes someone probably like mourning from exhaustion. Something that's really kind of interesting, I think. And you'll see this in an Italian Renaissance. You'll see it in the Northern Renaissance. But oftentimes we will have archaic representations, such as from the Bible, but we'll also have people in 15th century contemporary dress. So that's kind of interesting. And he holds a chalice and some type of implement. And then we have this very detailed floor, this red crimson. You can see this use of overpainting and the development of oil. And then we have, of course, probably an early book, because it wasn't really until the 1440s, as I've mentioned, that manuscripts were created. And so many of the people commissioning these altarpieces would be from aristocratic or religious families. And so they would have the opportunity to commission or pay for books. Now we're still directly in the control by the by the Burgundian court. But around 1485, I could be a little bit off on that, the Burgundian court goes into all of France. They're not in such tight control. And eventually, about 20 years after this painting was done, it's the Spanish Habsburgs who take over. And then in the 16th century, they're well into kind of controlling this region. But we're going to move on. And we're going to go to the work of a very interesting man, Hugo van der Goes. And Hugo van der Goes, sadly, had a very short career. He worked in Ghent, the city of Ghent, and he had a successful workshop there, but then he entered a monastery in Brussels. And Brussels was a very active city too at this time, and many of the royal families or members of the royal family would live in Brussels and then go out and spend time in Brudges and Ghent, or then sometimes settled there. So he uses incredible emotion in the Portinari altarpiece, and it was commissioned by the Portinari family. They were linked to the Italian courts. There's a lot of exporting and importing from this region into places like Germany and also Italy. This is a truly emotional triptych. Again, it's 3-panel. And what do we have? The birth of Jesus and the adoration of the shepherds kind of combined. So it is not called the adoration of the shepherds, but it is including the adoration of the shepherds. There's so much in this triptych that it could take us hours really to talk about it, but of course we don't have that time. But what Hugo van der Goes does that's quite remarkable, he uses reality. There's a difference between like the realism of these Flemish painters, detail, whether it's landscape or clothing or facial characteristics. But what he does is he uses people who are really reality-based. Like these are a little bit dirty, a little bit tattered shepherds. And I am reading a great biography of Caravaggio, the early 17th century Baroque Italian painter. And why am I mentioning it? Because we know that he really developed the idea of chiaroscuro of light, but he too, like Hugo van der Goes, very emotional men, he too liked to bring in realism, and he liked to bring in people who were a little bit scruffier. You might even see dirty hands or feet, which is kind of unique. It's not that common, and he sort of brings that to the fore. So we have the shepherds looking at the amazing birth of Jesus here, and he's surrounded by this ethereal light. And of course, Mary stands in wonder, and these angels too. What van der Goes does is he reduces the size of the angels and keeps the religious figures larger. And then we have the donors. And the donors are here, the two children of the donors, Portinari. And then we have St. Anthony with the bell, and I believe that St. Thomas with the spear, and then St. Margaret, and also Mary Magdalene. So Mary Magdalene holds an ointment jar, and St. Margaret has her emblems, Bible and a dragon. And then these are the mothers who commissioned, the wife of the man who commissioned this. We also have a lot of scenes. We have the fleeing here, and with Joseph and the donkey. We have animals watching. We have angels. And then we have really quickly, I need to, and look at this beautiful structure and the angels hovering, and we have a landscape. But we also have something I really want to point out, this emerging still life interest. And we have these flowers, and flowers throughout art history have always had an important metaphorical or allegorical reference. And we have the lilies that represent the purity of Mary. We have the passion with these two lilies. We have irises and columbines, which represent the seven sorrows and sorrows and significant episodes in Mary's life. And then the wheat of the Eucharist. Look how detailed. So he's able to capture realism and the religious nature of the painting, the beautiful robes of the angels, the seated patrons, all manner of detail. We're going to go on because I ran out of time. And we're going to go to the Monteforte altarpiece, also by Hugo van der Goes. And the Monteforte altarpiece was made for Spain, a college in Spain attached to a monastery. And so you can see so much of the skill of Hugo van der Goes. As I said, he was so attached to creating realism and beauty and finishing his artworks that he kind of went crazy because he was a perfectionist. And you see a lot of that in this image. So what do we have here? We have the adoration of the Magi, and then we have them kneeling, Casper, the older Magi, in this magnificent red robe. And we have Balthasar with a little bit of darker skin, and he was said to be from Africa, and he holds this exquisite reliquary, and he has these gold spurs, and he's very handsome, and he's followed by sort of helpers. And we have this sword here, and then we have Melchior, and he also has very detailed and embellished clothing with the ermine. And then we have this group of people looking in. Who are these people? Well, some say this is the portrait of Hugo van der Goes himself. We have people waiting to hear about this event. And we have, again, beautiful irises representing the seven sorrows. And this remarkable ruin here, brick by brick, we have a little still life. And then this squirrel running over the beam. And I don't recall what the squirrel represents. But you can also see the gold coins, and again, lots and lots of detail. Now, we were just going to look at this particular triptych, and Gerard David was considered the last of the great 15th century painters. He was from Bruges. He worked in the tradition of realism, although Jan van Eyck. He is a very subtle colorist. You don't see quite as deep and rich of colors, but he has these beautiful evocative landscapes, the vine-colored trees. And we have the beautiful flowers in the foreground, the middle ground, the city in the background. We have God hovering over this baptism by John, and this angel here. And then we have the donor panels, and another saint. So we have the Holy Spirit as it hovers over this important scene, and we have a very static painting. Now, if you look back, I just want to point something out here. This is not static. This has motion and emotion, and it has a lot of movement. It is not true for this. This is a very, and I say very still painting, and not in a pejorative way, but it just had that quiet water and stillness. But because of time, I will have to go on. I just adore this Madonna and Child with milk soup. Now, during this time, we did have the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, but still the control was by the Catholic Church, particularly in the Flemish region. It's really the Dutch region that bifurcates and becomes Protestant, but still a very deeply Catholic country, even into the 16th century. Now, by this time, the Habsburgs were ruling. The Valois French were kind of out of the picture in terms of being in charge. It's the Habsburgs. But I do want to show you some of the most beautiful aspects of this painting, Child with Milk Soup. It's a little more unusual. It is a topic that you might see, but you usually see the child being breastfed. Well, here's infant Jesus being fed a little gruel, kind of like maybe oatmeal or something soft. And he's examining in such a tender, charming way the spoon, like a child would. We've had children, Mary gazes upon her child with such beauty and love and devotion, such softness as she stirs the gruel. And then we have an apple and a slice of bread. So this is a middle-class home. We have a book, we have a woven basket, and a still life, again, purity perhaps, and looking out on the city with this lovely single point of perspective. The colors are very diffuse, some of it by the way he used the paint application and a little bit by aging. I will go on. And Jan Gossart. Now, he really worked mostly in France. He was born, it would be present day France. He worked in Bruges and Antwerp. And by 1508, he was service to one of the counts, French counts, Philip the Good, as it were. And he did go to diplomatic missions to Italy. And I wanted to point him out because he does go to Italy and he studies Italian ruins. And I will show you in just a moment how that is, you can see that. So this is a self-portrait. He's looking at the viewer, these beautiful hands, actually one hand, I remember I told you hands are most difficult, and also this face. And he looks at it with quite a detailed beard, these little brush strokes. You see these medallions in the hat. We don't quite know what that means, but this shows someone who has achieved a great status. So this is a self-portrait. Now, he did paint something that is reminiscent of the Italian sculptures that he would have seen. He went to Rome. And how do we know this? Well, I just mentioned it was documented. But look at this. This is reminiscent of Michelangelo's Moses, the unfortunate representation of the Jewish prophet Moses, because he's shown with horns. And that's a misinterpretation of the idea of Moses throwing down thunderbolts or God throwing down thunderbolts, and it was misinterpreted to be horns. That's rather unfortunate. Look at the swirling sculptural aspect of this painting. These figures look very sculptural. It's quite different than the early St. Luke painting the Virgin, but this is a theme that's been done many, many times in the North particular, because St. Luke was very prominent in the North. And then we have the swirling cloud, and these angels, the putti, who want to crown her Queen of the Heavens, and St. Luke is being aided by this multicolored angel, and he kneels and he studies, and you can actually see him drawing the representation. And then look at these pilasters. These are engaged columns with Doric capitals and an arch here, this recessed arch, and quite a remarkable representation. Okay, so I do want to just momentarily, just have maybe a minute or two. Adrian Eisenbrad, I only have one. This is a Christ crowned with thorns. He was also a remarkable painter. He became master of Bruges a little bit later in the early part of the 16th century. He was thought to be a disciple of Jared David, I just showed you. He had lots of followers, and I think this is such an exquisite representation of the crown with Christ crowned with thorns in the mourning Virgin. We don't see the people mourning. We only focus on Mary and her child. And it's so mournful and it's so beautiful at the same time. This exquisite gold inlay. And in a lot of these paintings, you would see elements of gold as it came from stylistically from the Byzantine and medieval times. We see this whole Renaissance city in amazing detail, the carvings, the applique, and it's so sorrowful. Look at the faces. We know he's tied, he's sacrificed, and it's a very sad, sad one. So let's just lastly, I have to show, I just want to see, okay, we have one more painting I'm going to show you really quickly. We cannot forget the great Pieter Brueghel the Elder. Pieter Brueghel was considered the master of the 16th century Northern Renaissance. If you look at the date, you will see that he really worked in the time that was during the Protestant Reformation, and he painted both Catholic and Protestant themes. So when we talk about the word Netherlandish, I would consider him more Netherlandish because he came from Breda, and Breda would be in today Holland. He visited Italy. We know that he went to Switzerland and Italy. And one of the, it's documented, he loved to paint parables. This is a parable of the sower. And we see these magnificent Alps. Now, you know, the Low Countries did not have Alps. Holland today, Belgium, Luxembourg, they didn't have Alps. But because he went into Italy and he was so captivated by what he saw, he incorporates that. He also was very involved with depicting parables. He did something like 15 books of parables. He worked with a publisher, and I believe he married the publisher's daughter, and he loved to paint parables because he was a religious man. And so this comes from the Gospels of Mark and Matthew and Luke, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And the parable of the sower goes, what you sow, you shall reap. So it's an allegorical reference to a farmer during that time in the 16th century, sowing the seeds to get a crop, just as Jesus is sowing the seeds and proselytizing here in the middle ground to background of the painting. So Jesus proselytizes to gather converts, and the farmer, proselytizes uses his skill to create a crop. What is so remarkable is this beautiful glazing and overpainting. And I hope you go visit the Timken and you have an opportunity to see one of the greatest works in our collection and one of the geniuses of Northern Renaissance art, Pieter Brueghel the Elder. Now, he had sons who were quite famous: Pieter Brueghel, a still life painter, Pieter Brueghel the Younger, who painted a lot of genre or peasant paintings. But Pieter Brueghel did a lot of, as I say, allegorical references to these parables that have religious significance. He was very religious, and he loved also to paint peasants. So we have, again, peasants represented here and here, and of course this steeple and the boats on the water, the birds, and again, this great attention to detail. So I see that my time is up, and perhaps Kyla can see if we have any questions. I'd be happy to answer any questions if there are any. Hi, Kyla.
Yeah, well, I want to first just say thank you for this amazing presentation, Karen. And if we do have any questions, feel free. Oh, it looks like we do have one question already in the chat. It's how do you explain the horns on Moses to the visitors when asked? Like rays of light?
Yes, because there was a misinterpretation. Remember, there's a lot of anti-Semitism. We have the Inquisition and all this going on. And it was supposed to be that these were bolts of thunder or lightning. And bolts of lightning, not thunder, bolts of lightning. And so it was misinterpreted as bolts. And so he was depicted as a horned prophet, which is rather unfortunate because, horns have this connotation of the devil and negative connotations. So it's a very unfortunate misinterpretation, but that's why those horns are present, because he had seen Michelangelo's work in Rome, and he carried that over into his work and that sculptural representation. But that's a good question. Any other?
I believe we had a question a few minutes ago, which was about a mirror in one of the images, but I was just going to ask you if you could talk more about the iconographical meaning of mirrors in like the Flemish art. I know that obviously the Arnolfini portrait is one.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yes. Okay. So the mirrors kind of reflect the purity of Mary. That's one interpretation. And so it also documents the witnessing of different scenarios. And so we want to have a witness present. For example, in the Arnolfini, we actually we think that Jan van Eyck, and I forgot to mention that, I think, in that particular one, but Jan van Eyck is said to be a witness. And if you don't mind, if you just let me go back to that, because I think it's worth looking at. Okay, perfect. So here, okay, so it relates to Mary, but it also relates to the Passion, documents scenes from the Passion, but we have the witnesses here. And it was said that perhaps Jan van Eyck himself was a witness. So it's all often the hand of the artist to show a witness to something. And these mirrors are pretty ubiquitous. And again, as I said, even artists like Velázquez in later centuries, in the 17th century, for example, was so captivated by the skill in which this mirror could be captured that they often use them. But so this one is used as a witness, but also represents, the significance of Mary. And one other thing I forgot to mention in this, Arnolfini is using his left hand to hold his beloved, and that sometimes is considered that she was of less stature. If he was holding her from the right hand, it would have been that she was of noble birth, but it's been said that she actually did come from more noble birth. So that's been, that concept has kind of been debated. But that was a very good question in terms of the mirror. So you see it, and I'm going to show you one more here. Again, convex mirror. These are witnesses, and also kind of telling a little story as well. I'm sorry, I'm going over. Are there any other questions that I'm just going to go through? And I didn't get to show the Tower of Babel. We probably won't have time for that. Paula, are there other questions to?
No, there's just more comments about how amazing all of the details you covered and everything, and how much people enjoyed your lecture.
Oh, I really appreciate that. My last comment is thank you for joining in, all of you. But it is there's so much, it's so rich and deep, but the paintings to me are so profoundly beautiful. They almost speak for themselves. They're so exquisite. And the Flemish, they use so much iconography. I could talk for probably a half hour just on this one painting, for example. So I'm glad that you learned. I hope you learned something, and I look forward to my next talk. So thank you, Kyla. And if there are no more questions, I guess we'll say adieu, and thank you for joining us.
Yes, and I just have one more thing to add, which is that if you guys would like to attend an event at the Timken in person, our August 14th event is the Wine and Masters with wine expert Rod Phillips. And it's a two-part event with first a lecture and then a wine tasting. Promises to be lots of fun. So thank you to Karen for this presentation, and thank you again for joining us, everyone.
And I will say real quick plug, the Timken events are some of the most enjoyable events I attend. I love them. I'm so glad we're having them again after COVID, but suffice to say, they're really worth it. So hopefully you will join us. But thank you all, and have a good day.